Chapter 16. It might have been a spider once, if spiders ever got to be the size of livestock. From the thick layer of white web that covered the room from floor to ceiling, it couldn't have been anything else. Jill felt her skin crawl as she stared down at the curled, bristling legs of the abomination. The creature that attacked her by the courtyard entrance had been terrifying, but it had also been so alien that she hadn't been able to relate it to anything else. Now, spiders, on the other hand, Jill already hated them. Hated their dark, bustling bodies and skittering legs. And the thing she was looking at right now had been the mother of them all. And even though it was dead, it still frightened her.
Hasn't been dead long, though.
She forced herself to look at it, at the slick puddles of greenish ichor that dripped from the holes in its rounded, hairy body. It had been shot several times, and judging from the noxious ooze that seeped from the wounds, she would have to guess that the not-so-itsy-bitsy spider had been alive and crawling not 20 minutes ago, maybe even less. She shuddered and stepped away towards the double metal doors that led out of the webbed chamber. Whispering streams of the sticky stuff clung to her boots, making it a struggle to move. She took careful, deliberate steps, determined not to fall. The thought of being covered in spiderweb, having it cling to her entire body, she shuddered again and swallowed thickly.
Think of something else, goddammit. Anything!
At least she knew she was on the right track and was close behind whoever had triggered the tunnel mechanism. A very interesting trick, that. When she reached the area where the pit had been, she thought maybe she'd gotten lost after all. The gaping hole had been gone, with smooth stone in its place. Looking up, she'd seen the ragged edges of the pit suspended overhead. The entire center section of the tunnel had been flipped over, turned like a giant wheel by some miracle of engineering. The doors had led to another straight, empty tunnel. A giant boulder stood at one end, and past that, the room she was about to leave. Jill grabbed the handle of one of the doors and pushed it open, stumbling out into yet another gloomy passage. She leaned back against the door and breathed deeply, barely resisting the urge to brush wildly at her clothes.
Put me up against zombies and monsters, no big thing. I can blow 'em away with the best of 'em. You show me a spider, I'll show you a girl losing her fucking mind.
The short, empty tunnel ran left to right in front of her, a door at either end. But the door to her left was set into the same wall as the one she'd just exited, leading back towards the courtyard. Jill opted for the one to the right, hoping that her sense of direction was still intact. The metal door was creaked open, and she stepped in, feeling the change in the air immediately. The tunnel split up in front of her. To the right, a thickening shadow where the rock walls opened into another corridor. But to her left was a small elevator shaft like the ones in the courtyard. A warm, delicious wind swept down and over her, the sweet air like a forgotten dream. Jill grinned to herself and started for the shaft, seeing that the lift's platform had been taken up. Odds were pretty good that she was still on the trail of Enrico's killer.
Maybe not. Maybe he went the other way, and you're about to lose him.
Jill hesitated, gazing wistfully at the small shaft, and then turned around as she sighed. She had to at least take a look. She walked into the stone corridor that stretched out in front of her, the temperature immediately dropping back to the now familiar, unpleasant chill. The tunnel extended several feet to her right and then dead-ended. On the other end, to her left, a good 100 feet away, was another massive rounded boulder, just like the one she'd seen earlier. And laying right in front of it was a small blue object. Jill frowned as she walked towards the giant rock, trying to make out what the blue object was. Halfway down the dim tunnel was an offshoot to the left, and she recognized the metal plate next to it as the same kind of mechanism that had moved the pit. She stepped into the small offshoot and examined the worn stones as its opening. There was a small door to her right, and Jill realized that the passage and the room could be hidden by way of the mechanism. The walls turned to block the entrance.
And to think I was impressed with the house. It must have taken them years to set all this up.
She opened the door and looked inside. It was a mid-sized square room of rough stone, with a statue of a bird on a pedestal as the only decoration. There was no other exit, but Jill felt a sudden rush of relief as the implication sank in. She could finally get out of the underground tunnels. The killer had to have left already. Smiling, she stepped back out into the corridor and started towards the giant rock, still curious about the blue thing. As she got closer, she saw that the object was actually a book bound in blue dyed leather. It had been thrown carelessly against the base of the stone, laying face down and open. She slung the Remington across her back and crouched down to pick it up. It was a book box. Her father had told her about them, though she'd never actually seen one. There was a cutaway section of pages behind the cover where valuables could be hidden, though this one was empty. She flipped it closed, tracing the gold leaf letters of the title, Eagle of East, Wolf of West, as she started back towards the elevator. Didn't sound like much of a thriller, though it was nicely bound. Jill froze as the stone beneath her left foot sank down a tiny bit, and she realized at the same instant that the entire tunnel gently sloped away from where she was standing.
Oh, shit.
Behind her, there was the deep, thundering sound of rock grating against rock. Dropping the book, Jill sprinted for cover, her arms and legs pumping as the rumbling grew louder and the tripped boulder picked up momentum. The dark opening of the offshoot seemed miles away, and she could almost feel the tons of stone bearing down on her. She wanted desperately to look, but she knew the split-second difference would kill her. In a final desperate burst of speed, she dove for the opening, crashing to the floor and jerking her legs in. In that same instant, the massive rock rolled past, missing her by inches. Even as she drew in her next gasping breath, the boulder hit the end of the tunnel with an explosive, bone-jarring crunch that shook the underground passage. For a few moments, it was all she could do to huddle against the cold floor and not throw up. When that passed, she slowly got to her feet and dusted herself off. The heels of her hands were abraded, and both her knees were bruised from the running dive. But compared to being smashed flat by a big rock, she could definitely live with a few abrasions and bruises. Jill unstrapped the Remington and headed for the elevator shaft, very much looking forward to leaving the underground behind, and keeping her fingers crossed that whatever came next, it wouldn't be cold, there wouldn't be any boulders, and that there wouldn't be any spiders. The basement was flooded, all right. Chris stood at the top of a short ramp that led to the basement doors, staring down at his own unsmiling face reflected off of the shimmering water. It looked cold and deep. After he left Rebecca, he continued down the hall and found room 003 at the end, the ladder to the basement level tucked discreetly behind a bookcase in the neatly kept bedroom. He descended into a chilly concrete corridor with buzzing fluorescent lights overhead, a dramatic change from the plain wood and simple style of the bunkhouse above. Well, at least I found the basement. It seemed that killing Plant 42 was their only option for escape after all. Chris hadn't come across any other exit from the bunkhouse, which meant that it was either past the plant's room or there was no back door, a thought that left him distinctly unsettled. It didn't seem possible, but then again, neither did a carnivorous plant. And you won't find out until you get this over with. Chris sighed and stepped into the water. It was cold, and it had an unpleasant chemical smell. He waded down to the door, the water sliding up over his knees and finally stopping at mid-thigh, sloshing gently. Shivering, he pushed the door open and moved inside. The basement was dominated by a giant glass-fronted tank in the center of the room that extended from floor to ceiling, with a large jagged hole toward the bottom of the right-hand side. Now, Chris wasn't that good at judging volume, but to fill the whole area with water, he figured that the tank had to have held several thousands of gallons. What the hell were they studying down here that they needed that much? Tidal waves? It didn't matter. He was cold, and he wanted to find what he needed to find and get back to dry land. He started off toward the left, slowly straining against the push and pull of the gently lapping waves. It was completely surreal. wading through a half-flooded, well-lit concrete room. Though Chris supposed it was no stranger than anything else he experienced since the Alpha Copter had set down. Everything about the Spencer estate had a dreamlike feel to it, as if it existed in its own reality, far removed from the rest of the world.
Try nightmare-like. Killer plants, giant snakes, the Walking Dead. Hell, all that's missing is a flying saucer and maybe a dinosaur.
He heard a soft sloshing sound behind him and glanced over his shoulder, and saw a thick, triangular fin rise up from the water 20 feet away and slide towards him, a wavering gray shadow beneath.
Oh, fuck!
Panic shot through him, an all-encompassing panic that seared away rational thought. He took a giant running step and realized he couldn't run as he plunged face first into the cold chemical water and came up gasping, sputtering tainted liquid from his nose and mouth, hoping to God that Rebecca was right about the virus having burned itself out. He whipped his head around, eyes burning and searching for the fin, and saw to his horror that it had halved the distance between them. He could see it now. A shark, its rippling, distorted body sliding easily through the water, 10 or 12 feet long, its broad tail lashing it forward, the black soulless eyes set upon its pointed grin. Chris stumbled away backwards, knowing he didn't stand a chance of outrunning it. Wheeling his arms for balance, he sloshed heavily through the dragging water, turning himself sideways and managing a few more steps before the shark was on top of him. And he leapt to the side, dodging the animal and slapping the water as violently as he could, churning it into foaming waves. The shark slid past him, its smooth, heavy body brushing against his leg. As soon as it was past, Chris stumbled after it, splashing wildly to keep up as he turned the corner in the flooded room. If he could stay close enough, it wouldn't be able to turn and get at him, except that in seconds, the shark would have room to maneuver. He could see 2 doors ahead on the left, but the giant fish was already leaving him behind, heading toward the next corner to turn around and come back for him. Chris took a deep breath and plunged into the water. He knew it was insane, but he didn't have a better option. He stroked desperately towards the first door, kicking off the cement floor to propel himself forward in great bounding leaps. He hit the door just as the shark was turning up ahead and grabbed for the handle, choking. And it was locked.
Shit!
Chris jammed his hand into his wet vest and came up with Elias's keys, fumbling through them as the fin glided closer and the wide-pointed grin opened. He shoved a key into the lock, the last key on the ring that he hadn't found a room for, and slammed his shoulder against the door at the same time, the shark now only a few feet away. The door flew open and Chris stumbled in, falling and kicking frantically. His boot connected solidly with the shark's fleshy snout, deflecting it from the opening. In a flash, he was back on his feet. He threw his weight into the door, and in a slap of water, it was closed. He sagged against the door, wiping at his stinging eyes with the back of his hand. The lapping water settled gently into smaller and smaller ripples as he caught his breath and his vision cleared. For the moment, he was safe. He unholstered his Beretta and ejected the dripping magazine, wondering how the hell he was going to make it back upstairs. Looking around the small room, he saw nothing he could use as a weapon. One wall was lined with buttons and switches, and he trudged over to take a look at them, drawn to a blinking red light in a far corner.
Looks like I found a control room. Nice. Maybe I could turn off the lights and get Jaws to go to sleep.
There was a lever set next to the flashing light, and Chris stared down at the faded tape beneath it, feeling a numb disbelief as he read the printed letters. Emergency drainage system.
Are you fucking kidding me? Why the hell didn't anybody pull this thing the second the tank broke?
The answer occurred to him even as he thought it. The people who worked here were scientists. There was no way in hell they were going to turn down the opportunity to study their precious Plant 42, sucking up water from the man-made lake. Chris grabbed the lever and pushed it down. There was a sliding metallic noise outside the door, and immediately the water level started to drop. Within a minute, the last of it had flowed out from under the door, and a gurgling liquid gas came from the direction of the broken tank. He walked back to the door, opening it carefully, and heard the frantic, wet thumps of a very big fish trying to swim through air. Chris grinned, thinking that he should probably feel pity for the helpless creature, and instead hoped that it died a long, agonizing death. "Bite me," he whispered. Wesker had shot 4 of the shuffling, gasping umbrella workers on his way to the computer room on level 3. He hadn't recognized any of them, though he was pretty sure that the second one he'd taken out had been Steve Keller, one of the guys from Special Research. Steve always wore penny loafers, and the pallid, dried-up husk that reached for him by the stairs had been wearing Steve's brand. It seemed that the effects of the viral spill had been far harsher in the labs. Less messy, but no less disquieting. The creatures that roamed the halls outside seemed to have been totally dehydrated, their limbs withered and stringy, and their eyes like shriveled grapes. Wesker managed to avoid several of them, but the ones he had been forced to put down had scarcely bled at all. He sat at the computer in the cool, sterile room and waited for the system to boot up, feeling truly on top of things for the first time all day. He had earlier moments, of course. The way he handled Barry, finding the wolf metal in the tunnels, even shooting Ellen Smith in the face had given him a momentary sense of accomplishment, a feeling that he was in control of what was happening. But so much had gone wrong along the way that he hadn't had time to enjoy any of his successes. But now I'm here. If the stars aren't already dead, they soon will be. And assuming I don't suffer some massive lapse of skill, I'll be out of here within half an hour. Mission accomplished. There were still dangers ahead, but Wesker could handle them. The MA2s, the Chimeras, were undoubtedly loose in the power room, but they were easy enough to get past, provided of course he didn't stop running. Wesker should know. He had a sizable hand in designing the creatures. And then there was the big man. The Tyrant, waiting one level down in his glass shell, sleeping the sweet, dreamless sleep of the damned, from which he'll surely never wake. Such a waste, though. So much power, crossed off as a failure by the boys at White Umbrella. A gentle musical tone informed him that the system was ready. Wesker pulled a notebook out of his vest and opened it to a list of codes, though he already knew them. John Howe had set the system up months ago, using his name and the name of his girlfriend, Ada, as access keys. Wesker typed out the first of the passwords that would allow him to unlock the laboratory doors, feeling a sudden vague wistfulness for the excitement of the day. It would be over so soon, and there was no one around to witness his achievements, to share his fond memories after the fact. Now that he thought about it, it was actually a shame that none of the stars would be joining him. The only thing better than a grand finale was a grand finale with an audience.